Well, I'm a materialist, and I think that most scientists are materialists, and that I believe that everything in the world is made out of material atoms. Now, there might be some very complicated arrangement of those atoms, but I don't believe that there's any non-material essence. On the other hand, that's the material part of that name I give myself. I also appreciate spiritual experiences, and I'm open to them. And by spiritual experiences, I mean feeling connected to things larger than ourselves, the appreciation of beauty, feeling connection to nature. Those are some of the aspects of spirituality are very important to me, and that I feel that we must be open to.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Can beauty be a source of spirituality and transcendence, even if you don't believe in a God or higher power? My guest today thinks so. Alan Lightman is an American physicist, writer, and social entrepreneur. He served on the faculties of Harvard and MIT and was the first person at MIT to receive dual faculty appointments in science and the humanities. He's currently professor of the practice of the humanities at MIT. Lightman is the recipient of 6 honorary doctoral degrees, and is the author of numerous books, both fiction and nonfiction, including Einstein's Dreams, which was an international bestseller, and The Diagnosis, which is a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. His essays concern the intersection of science, culture, philosophy, and theology. Lightman is also the host of the public TV series Searching, Our Quest for Meaning in the Age of Science, which is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. His latest book is The Transcendent Brain, Spirituality in the Age of Science. Alan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Brandon.
Alan, to get started, could you share a story of profound beauty from your childhood? I mean, you're such a master storyteller, and I know you probably have many examples that come to mind, but anything that stays with you till today, a memory of profound beauty from your childhood?
Well, of course, there are many moments of beauty that we all experience. Remembering something from childhood is a little bit of a challenge, but I will tell you one image that I had that I remember. My family, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and my family took vacations occasionally, once every year, to Kentucky Lake, which was in Kentucky and not, a few hours drive from Memphis, Tennessee. One morning, we stayed in a hotel next to the lake, and one morning I got up early, and there was a mist hanging over the lake, and it was kind of bluish and purplish. It was just gorgeous. It was like I was in a fairyland or something. It was a very surreal image, and I will remember that always.
Wow. I remember you sharing an experience of collecting, was it fireflies or some kind of bugs that was that the same place?
No, that was a different place. The fireflies coming into synchrony and their flashing occurs many places around the country, but certainly there were plenty of fireflies in the south part of the U.S. where I grew up.
Right. Were you particularly attentive to nature as a child and to beauty? Was that really something you paid attention to a lot in your childhood?
Well, I was certainly attentive to nature. I went to summer camp several years in a row, and we spent a lot of time outdoors learning how to identify different trees and different plants. So I had that experience with nature. I did write poetry as a child, and I think some of the poems that I wrote had to do with nature. I couldn't recite any of them now, and they're probably pretty awful. But
but being able to come up with a poem as a child is remarkable. And I think a lot of us, my experience growing up in the sort of Indian subculture was, as a child, you were either steered into art or science, and it was almost discouraged. I remember growing up wanting to be, I was good at sketching portraits of people's faces, and I was a bit of a musician, and that was discouraged by my family because, I was supposed to go into engineering or medicine and,
Right.
work on your math homework. The art is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Were art and science equally encouraged in your family or in your school, or what allowed you to nurture both sides of your interests?
Well, let me say that I think that many children have an interest and even an aptitude for both art and science. The experience that you relate that happened to you is what happens in many cases, that teachers, friends, parents push you in one direction or the other because life is just easier if you're either the artist type or the scientist type. And of course, that stands for being more intuitive versus being more deliberate. But I had an interest in both art and science from a very young age, and I don't know where I got it from. Neither of my parents had anything to do with science. When I got into school, of course, I took, like many people, I took both art classes and science classes, and I know that I wrote stories and poetry from a very young age, but I also had my own little laboratory that I built and shot rockets into the neighbors' yards. I did notice by the time I got into high school, let's say at age 15 or 16, that I had two distinct different groups of friends. I had the artist, intuitive type friends, and I had the scientific, deliberate, rational type friends. And I wasn't aware of having two separate groups of friends until I got to be about 16 years old. It didn't seem to me to be very unusual. I easily went back and forth between one group of friends and the other, but in retrospect, I realized that I really did have two different groups of friends.
Wow. And it seems you've continued to be a bridge builder between those domains for the rest of your life. How did you end up then pursuing physics for your career, at least to start?
I was interested in both the arts and the sciences. When I entered university, I knew of some scientists who later became writers, like C.P. Snow.
Right.
But I didn't know of any writers who later became scientists. So even though I didn't understand the reason for these different trajectories, I did accept that message. And so I decided that I should start my career in science, but I didn't abandon my interest in the arts and in literature. I continued to write, but I did the writing as a hobby on weekends and evenings, and I put most of my time into science. The reason why I was attracted to physics among other sciences is because I have a philosophical bent, and physics is the science that's closest to philosophy.
Yeah, that's great. And you pursue questions that are certainly challenging philosophically to address around the origins of the universe, and those are long-standing philosophical questions. I want to ask a little bit about the role of beauty in science, and as you know from some of the work we've done with scientists around the world, we find that there seem to be at least three different types of beauty. There's the sensory aspect of the phenomena you're studying, whether it's the stars or the cells you're looking at. There's a heuristic value for beauty, relying on beautiful equations as a guide to truth, perhaps. And then what we're calling the beauty of understanding, that grasping of the hidden order or inner logic of things, which seems to many scientists like a kind of harmony, a sense of profound fit. And some have even told us that's the driving force for what they do. That's why they are bench scientists. That's why they didn't go to work in industry or, have given up lucrative careers elsewhere, etc. What do you think of these three modes of beauty? And have you found them in your own experience? Are there other modes of beauty in science that you've come across?
Well, I think that's I did look at your short 3-minute video where you describe those three different modes of beauty or experience of beauty. And I think that those categories make a lot of sense to me. I do know that beauty has been a very useful guide in science, and especially in theoretical physics, where it is always a criteria that seems to guide us to the right theories and the right equations. There are a few notable counterexamples. where nature doesn't follow our conception of beauty. The most prominent counterexample is something called parity violation. Parity conservation is the idea that everything that we see in a mirror also exists in nature. That is, a left-handed version of everything that's right-handed version also exists in nature, that nature does not have a handedness.
Mm.
And we found in experiments in the 1960s that actually nature does have a handedness, that the right and left are not identical as far as natural phenomena. So that was kind of a shock to physicists, and a wake-up call that our human sense of beauty does not always accord with what we find in nature. But there are many, many other examples where if a physicist has a choice between choosing between two theories and one of them is more beautiful than the other, the more beautiful one is usually the correct one.
Yeah.
So I think that it has been a very useful guide in science. So it's not that surprising to me that our human concept of beauty is obeyed by non-human nature, because we are a part of nature. We evolved over millions of years from nature. We are part of nature ourselves. We're not separate from nature. And so for that reason, it's not surprising to me that our experience of beauty, our concept of beauty, is usually in accord with nature.
Yeah. There's some who've argued that it's that the challenge is once you start to have a track record for a certain kind of aesthetic, then you can be more easily misled, right? So
yes,
there's a lot of debates now around what's happening at CERN and whether that's just chasing beautiful mathematics, right? And you had an example, I think, from your early childhood of being misled by beauty, of building a rocket, and could you share that story?
Well, among the many science projects I did as a kid, I built rockets, and I mixed my own rocket fuel and had my own ignition system and everything. The rocket itself, in my view, was beautiful, and I often painted my rockets or put decals on them because I thought that added to their beauty. And one of the things that I did was I had, when I put tail fins on my rocket, what I should have done was riveted them on, which would have been a much stronger bond. But I just glued them on because I thought the rivets would spoil the beauty of the rocket. And of course, after flying for just a few hundred feet, the glued tail fins came off and the rocket spun out of control and crashed. Yeah. That was an example where my sense of aesthetics clashed with my more rational, practical side.
Yeah. How do you recommend scientists sort through this? Because it's at times it's hard to think about what other criterion you would use to move forward other than beauty, right? When you come up with a hypothesis you want to test, the more beautiful equation seems to be the thing to invest in.
What are the other criteria? Logical consistency is certainly very, very important. Your theory has to also be in accordance with the known body of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And when you set out to invent a new theory or pursue a new theory in science, you're never inventing out of whole cloth, because there's always a large body of knowledge that you have to be in accordance with. Now, sometimes you'll have a new theory that departs from the previous theory just very slightly in terms of its predictions, but it's conceptually very different.
Yeah.
But in the end, science is an experimental endeavor. That we have all kinds of wonderful ideas about the way nature should behave, but in the end, we have to test our theories against experiment, and that distinguishes science from many other human activities. We have this external reality check that you don't have in the arts, you don't have in philosophy. There are many other endeavors. I mean, I would argue that you don't have it in theology either. although I'm sure that there would be many theologians who would disagree with me on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge, I suppose, now in areas of physics where it's hard to imagine what experimental testing would look like, right? When it comes to some aspects of string theory or multiverses. And
that's right. So that raises the interesting question of whether, if we are working on theories that are either extremely difficult or impossible to test, are we really doing science, or are we doing philosophy?
Right. Yeah.
And as you correctly point out, modern physics has gotten backed itself into a corner these days with the multiverse, with string theory, where we don't really know how to test our theories. There may be no way to test whether other universes exist. There may be no way to.
Yeah.
And the origin of the universe, of course, is another example. We're never going to know for sure how our universe began. But if we have a theory that correctly predicts all the phenomena in our present day universe, then it's not unreasonable to extrapolate backwards in time.
One of the things I was, talking with Sabine Hassenfelder on this podcast a few months ago, and one thing she argued for was leaning more on something like mathematical consistency or theoretical consistency, much more than aesthetic criteria. And so you can have some account that is mathematically consistent, but looks really ugly. And maybe that's what you should invest in. But it's very hard to convince people that that's...
Well, that's usually not the case. The aesthetic guide has a very, very good track record.
Yeah.
So I would say try the aesthetically pleasing theory first, as we did with parity conservation, and only when you find that it's violated by nature do we turn to a more complex theory.
Right. Yeah. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about your work on spirituality. You call yourself a spiritual materialist. Could you say what you mean by that?
Well, I'm a materialist in that, and I think that most scientists are materialists, and that I believe that everything in the world is made out of material atoms. Now, there might be some very complicated arrangement of those atoms, but I don't believe that there's any non-material essence. On the other hand, that's the material part of that name I give myself. I also appreciate spiritual experiences, and I'm open to them. And by spiritual experiences, I mean feeling connected to things larger than ourselves, the appreciation of beauty, feeling connection to nature. Those are some of the aspects of spirituality are very important to me, and that I feel that we must be open to. Now, that definition of spirituality may or may not include the existence of God. There's some people that feel that all of their spiritual experiences are mediated by God, whatever their conception of God is, and we could talk about what God is. But I think that my conception of spirituality does not require a divine being who created the universe. So since I put great value in these kinds of spiritual experiences, and I'm also a materialist, that's why I call myself a spiritual materialist.
Yeah. That's you have a wonderful example which you've shared many times, many places, and it'd be great to hear you to narrate that story about falling into infinity while you were on the boat, because I think that would give our listeners a good picture of the kind of experience you're talking about.
Well, in the summer, my wife and I, and my wife is a painter, we spend our summers on a small island in Maine, and there are no roads or bridges to the island, so every person on the island, there's 6 families, we all have our own boats and our own docks. And one night I was coming back to my house on the island. I was out in the ocean in my boat. It was very late at night. I think it was after midnight. A very dark night sky, no moon, but a clear sky. So the stars were fierce, I would describe them. fiercely shining. And I decided that I wanted to have a closer connection to the night sky. So I turned off the engine of the boat, and it got even quieter. There were no other boats out on the water except mine. And then I turned off the running lights of the boat, and it got even darker. And I lay down in the boat and looked up at the sky. And after a few moments, I felt like I was dissolving into the sky. I lost track of my body. I lost track of time, lost track of myself. And I was just merging with the stars up there. And I felt like I was really a part of the heavens. It also had this experience had a strange aspect of time, that I felt like the infinite past and the infinite future had been compressed to a dot. And it was just this moment of existence. I don't know exactly how long I was lying there because I didn't look at my watch. But after a while, I got up and started the engine again and then went home.
Yeah, beautiful. There might be people who have similar experiences and perhaps don't value it in the way you do. And I'm curious to know what you think about why it is that for some of us, these moments are really significant. And for others, they might be,
Well, I don't really know. I think that all of us have experiences that have some similarity to this one that may not be lying on a boat in Maine.
Yeah.
There's a Hindu expression called darshan, and you probably are very familiar with it, coming from India, which, I think there are several different translations of it, but I translate it as being open to the divine, or being open to the sublime, I would say. And I think that in Hinduism, at least, that we are encouraged to be open to the sublime. I wish that everyone was open to the sublime. I think most people are, but we lead such busy lives these days with the pace of life is regulated by our communication devices, our smartphones and the internet. And we're always checking off items on our to-do list. We live a very fast-paced life, much too fast for our own good. And I think that we don't take the time to just be present and just experience the world. We're just rushing from one thing to the next. I think that our communication technology has done many, many good things. It allows us to stay in touch with family members who are on the other side of the planet. But it also has this downside of having sped up the pace of life and really robbed us of these quiet moments where we can just be instead of doing, just being. And the ability, I think this is part of what darshan is all about, of just surrendering yourself to the moment, not worrying about being anywhere, not worrying about accomplishing anything, not worrying about your to-do list, but just taking some time out of the day. And it would be great if everybody could do this for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes a day, and just being in the moment, letting your mind go where it wants to go.
Yeah. I grew up Hindu, and we would, when I was a child, would go to the temple pretty regularly, and so darshan would be a kind of encounter, right, when you go to the temple. But because we were in a consumeristic society, it was a very transactional mode of encounter, where you go into the moment of darshan is when you have the sacred flame and you sort of put your hands above it and then you bless yourself. So you're receiving a blessing from the divine, but usually you're carrying to that, help me with my finances and help me with my studies. And so it's a very transactional mode that is quite the opposite of what you are suggesting, which I think is closer to the truer meaning. I had, as a kid, very rare moments of transcendence in the temple, and the one vivid example that comes to mind is of, I grew up in the Middle East, in Oman mostly, so it's the Arabian desert, very hot. We go to the Hindu temple there, you take off your shoes as you should, and then the stone cold floors of the temple are quite a stark contrast to the dry heat outside. And then you go in, there's loud noises of bells. So it's not being, quiet in nature. It's a very noisy environment, lots of smells of incense. The priest is chanting very loudly, and you receive a sweet. So a sweet offering is given to the gods, and you receive that. And that's an explosion of flavors in your mouth. All right. So for me, it was that combination of sights, sounds, smells, etc. And it was happening during a particularly difficult time in my childhood. My mom, when I was about 7 or 8, started to hallucinate and develop psychotic episodes. And so it was a traumatic experience at home, but it was contrasted by something that seemed to be, for me, a promise from another world that this will be okay. Like there's something more, that there's something sweet and something delightful in this world that I don't create, that is given to me, right? And so there's the possibility of gratitude in spite of these challenges. And it's something that I learned to, as a kid, dismiss as I tried to, survive with my studies and move on. But I've returned to it, since then a number of times as an example of the kind of transcendent experience I think that you're talking about, which in my context happened in more of a religious setting. But I don't think I lost my belief in God very young, but it was still at that time a very profound experience. All right, that's a great stopping point for the first half of our conversation. Stay tuned for the second half next week, where Alan talks about why spirituality matters and whether there are questions that science cannot answer. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already, and please leave us a review. We'd love to hear what you think about the show.